Hello, email marketers and entrepreneurs. I'm going to talk about email authentication and DMARC today. First, I'm going to talk about authentication, which includes SPF and DKIM authentication. Then I'm going to talk about the DMARC policy system. And the reason I'm talking about this today is because Google and Yahoo recently announced that on February 1st, 2024, they're going to be implementing a new policy that's going to require email providers who send more than 5,000 emails in a day to have all three email authentication protocols, SPF, DKIM, and DMARC set up. And if you don't have them set up, they will likely be flagged as spam or rejected, which means bounced. So they might go to spam, or they might not even go through if you don't have all three of those set up after February 2024. And the first one that I'm going to talk about is SPF. SPF is an authentication for your emails. This involves adding a record to your DNS that lists domains or IP addresses that you are going to give permission to send emails on your behalf. And domains are going to include domains that third parties that may send on your behalf, or maybe your own domain that you're sending from. This is a pretty simple authentication. It pretty much just either lists an IP address or a domain, and that tells email providers anytime they see something coming from there, they can check your domain, this DNS record, and see that was approved by your SPF record. The next one I'm going to talk about is the DKIM record, and the DKIM is a little more secure than the SPF. The DKIM involves adding a DNS record, which is going to list a key or list a URL that is some URL that might host a key, and the provider that gives you this key is going to have a matching key that the email recipient's inbox, the email provider that they have, can check to see if the key matches. And this is like, it's a little more secure because it's it's an encrypted key, so it's more than just making sure that the domain it matches comes from a spoofer. Like if somebody was pretending to spoof you and send emails on your behalf, they could easily probably set up a third party, and third parties usually require verification, so there'll be some email sent to you. But if they could happen to get you to click a verification email, then they'll be approved with that third party to send, and they could easily set up an SPF record. But a DKIM key is something that is, like I said, it's encrypted. You're going to get this from the provider. They're going to be putting the corresponding key in the email content itself, in the header. You don't see it in the email, but it's not something that somebody could easily copy from the outside, and it would require them to have access to your DNS record in order to add that record. So even if they got you to click a verification email, they wouldn't be able to be DKIM authenticated. So that's SPF and DKIM authentication. Next, I'm going to talk about DMARC policy. And what does the DMARC do? DMARC does two main things. One, it tells the email recipient providers where to send DMARC reports. The reports that you get from your recipients are going to tell you whether or not your emails were authenticated, if DKIM authenticated, if they're SPF authenticated. It's also going to tell you if the authentication was aligned with your policy requirements, your DMARC policy requirements. And another thing, primary thing that the DMARC policy does, it tells email recipient providers how to handle emails that are not authenticated. So you can tell them, if it's not authenticated, do nothing, let the email through. You can tell them if it's not authenticated, put it in spam. You can tell them if it's not authenticated, bounce the email and reject it and don't let it go through. Send a bounce message. So that's the primary things that a DMARC is focused on. The benefits of the DMARC policy is protects you against spoofing. If you tell them to send emails to spam or bounce them, then if somebody does try to pretend to be you, if they don't have access to your DNS, their emails are likely not going to be authenticated, and they are if you have a policy that says put it in spam or bounce, their emails are going to spam or they're going to bounce, so they're not going to get through. And so this protects you against people pretending to be you. The second benefit of DMARC is that it helps you to verify that your own emails are authenticated. It's possible when you're setting up your DNS records, you could make a mistake. Maybe you have some email channels that are sending emails that you forgot about and you haven't tried to authenticate them. So the DMARC reports that you get back, you'll get reports on every email sent on behalf of your domain, and if there's anything that's not authenticated, the reports will tell you these emails were not SPF or they were not DKIM authenticated. So the third benefit of DMARC is your email reputation. So email providers can tell if you have a DMARC policy set up, and email providers know that if you are watching your reports, then you're, especially if you have a policy that says to put emails in spam or to reject them, they know then that you're protected from spoofing, and they also know if you're getting reports that there's a good chance you're monitoring your email activity, and that that way if something's happening and you can take action against it if need be. And so this helps your reputation, because email providers, they don't like spam, and if you can take some efforts to stop spammers who might be pretending to be you, even if it's unlikely it might happen to you in particular, email providers prefer that you are taking a proactive approach to protecting yourself against this from happening. And if everybody does this helps to reduce spam. So the businesses that do this, email providers give a little more respect to. So this helps even before the changes that are coming into effect in February, and even for other providers besides Gmail and Yahoo, having a DMARC policy set up will help your domain reputation. Having the authentication for SPF and DKIM as well, even if you didn't have a DMARC policy, those as well are a benefit to your email reputation. Now, one last thing I'm going to talk about is an aggregator. Now, there's a lot of aggregators out there. I at this moment in time prefer to use EasyDMARC. EasyDMARC and other aggregators, what they do is they will take your reports and collate them. Especially if you're sending 5,000 or more emails a day, that's a lot of reports to go through. The reports are kind of complicated. They're hard to look at. There's no way you're going to look at them one by one, 5,000 in a day, or especially if you're sending higher volume than that, 50,000, 100,000, a million emails. It's going to be impossible for you to review all the reports. So what the aggregator does is it collates these reports into easy to read charts and graphs and lists so that you can easily see where the emails are coming from, which ones are passing SPF, which ones are passing DKIM, which ones are aligned with your DMARC policy, and this helps you to identify the sources of problems quickly and helps you identify if you have been successfully fixed those problems. So I always recommend setting up SPF and DKIM and a DMARC policy, and include in your DMARC policy, the DMARC policy tells you where to send the reports. I would always include emails for an aggregator, set up an aggregator account, and use those to make it easier for you to review those reports. I'm going to talk about one more thing too. A lot of third parties. I'm a MailChimp guy, and MailChimp isn't the only one though. There's a lot of third-party providers out there, and some of them will support SPF alignment, some of them will not. Now that doesn't mean they don't support SPF authentication. Usually their SPF, pretty much all of the third-party providers that send email are going to support SPF, although it'll use an SPF record that they're hosting on their own domain, and SPF authentication requires a record from the DNS, but authenticating an email is different than having it align with your policy, your DMARC policy. So an email might be authenticated according to these new requirements. You might meet these requirements and it might be authenticated, but your reports might show that the SPF is not aligned with your DMARC. It might show a fail in the SPF column for some third-party providers. Usually, if you have a good aggregator DMARC, you can actually look and you can see that it is still passing SPF authentication, even though it's not aligned with the policy. That's one good thing about Easy DMARC I like. But if you have a third party and you see in your aggregator that it's failing SPF, there's a good chance that it doesn't support SPF alignment, and that has to do with the fact that the return path for an email, which is the return path is where a email recipient sends a bounce report. So like if you send an email in MailChimp, it tracks like click and open data, and it also tracks how many emails bounce. Now, when an email bounces, if you've ever sent an email to a bad address from your own personal box, you probably know that you get a message back that says, hey, this was undeliverable. It didn't bounce, or it didn't go through, it bounced. And that's because when you send an email from your own inbox, the return path is your own inbox. So you get those undeliverable messages yourself. Well, MailChimp wants to track those. So they put their own domain, they put an email address of their own as the return path for those bounce messages. So when you send a bulk message on MailChimp or a lot of other third parties, you don't get back messages in your own inbox that say, oh, undeliverable, this bounced, when an email bounced. And the reason you don't get those when you send with a bulk provider like that is because they go to the bulk provider. They have a different return path for those messages. And SPF alignment with a DMARC policy requires that the return path match the domain that the SPF record is on. And so since the return path is their own, it's going to match their SPF record, not yours. So your SPF record for third parties may be listed as unaligned or failed in your aggregator, while in actuality they're actually still SPF authenticated. It's just doing it through the MailChimp domain or the third-party bulk provider domain. So that's one thing to keep in mind about SPF. Pretty much everybody supports DKIM though, so whatever you're using, DKIM should always be passing. It should always show aligned, and definitely recommend that you always have a DMARC policy as well. Another thing to say about the DMARC policy is that the ideal goal is to have a quarantine policy, or which tells them to put it in spam if it's not authenticated, or a reject policy, which tells them to bounce the email if it's not authenticated. If you have a none policy, it says just let all emails through, no matter if they're authenticated or not. Email providers don't prefer you to have that policy because you're not protected from spoofers if you have a policy like that. Although it is good to have a relaxed none policy in the beginning while you're making sure your own emails are authenticated. It's good to have a relaxed policy until you know your own emails are good. But once you know your own emails are good, ideally the end goal of your DMARC policy should be to switch to a reject or a quarantine policy. The most ideal would be a reject policy that bounces emails that are not authenticated. The reputation of your domain is going to be more respected by email providers. Your emails are less likely to land in spam if you have a reject policy. You have to be careful with that though, because if you have any of your own emails that are not authenticated, they are likely to bounce or go to spam if you have a reject policy. So you want to make sure your own emails are all authenticated first. And also, if you're working on setting up some new email provider, new third-party service or something, if everything's passing, but then you set something new up and this new provider isn't authenticated, those will bounce as well. So anytime you set up, if you have a reject policy, anytime you set up something new, you may want to relax your policy again until you can make sure they're authenticated, or keep an eye closely on your DMARC reports after you set it up so that you can make sure your own emails are not bouncing or going to spam as well. So I think that's the basic run through of the authentication and DMARC systems. Because of this change in Google, it's highly recommended everybody get these 3 set up for their business. If you have like a free Gmail account or something, you don't have to worry about this stuff because it's already built in. But if you have a domain that you've purchased, if you have mybusiness.com and you're sending from John Smith at mybusiness.com, something like that, then it's very important that you have your authentication and DMARC set up before you do any email sending. This is going to be true for third-party providers like MailChimp or other third parties. And if you have like a Google Workspace account or a Microsoft Outlook account, you're going to want all of those email channels authenticated and aligned with your DMARC, and have a DMARC policy they align with.